Hello, I am Erik Mansén, and this is my final oral presentation of the technology and code that we used in the TDDD27 Cookbook project. So in this video I will tell you a bit about the various frameworks and technologies that we use to create our web page. There is quite a lot of code, so in the interest of making it brief, I will try to be as quick as possible, and I am going to do this by essentially going through the different folders in our project and describe why it looks the way it does and what the different pieces of the code does. So the first thing you need to know about a project is that it is made primarily with a framework known as Gatsby.js, which is a site generator, which means that it essentially gives us access to various build tools and minifiers, and Gatsby is also responsible for deciding the basic file structure and layout of our project, as everything has to match that structure. So we can see here all of our important code is placed in this source folder. So the first thing about Gatsby is that Gatsby will always expect a folder called Pages. In Pages you place a bunch of HTML renderable files. In this case we are using the built-in React support in Gatsby to render React pages, which means we have a bunch of .tsx files for extended TypeScript. The index file will always be... this is also how Gatsby handles its routing. So what will essentially happen is whatever URL you have to your page, you will always find what is defined by the index file here. So in this case, our index file defines our login page. And if you go to our web page /editor, you will get the editor page, or /recipe search, you will find this. You will find whatever is defined by this page, and so on and so forth. These pages we have tried to keep as small as possible, and instead focus on the components that they render, that they contain. So in this case, we have the recipe search page, which is where you go to search for recipes. You will see that it actually just renders our layout component, which is the blue bar that you find when you are on our website that tells you if you're logged in or not and gives you access to the navigation drawer. And within it we render a recipe search component, which is where we have all the logic for actually searching for recipes. All of our components, with two exceptions that I will get to, are placed in the components folder here, and we have tried to group them out in logical places. So for the recipe search we have the recipe search subfolder, where we can find this recipe search component. So if I open that up, we'll see here that it is a fairly normal React component, where we have also tried to break out as much as possible smaller components into smaller pieces of code into their own components. So we have the recipe search bar, and then a infinite scroll, which is a third-party component that we found that allows us to easily write out and handle dynamically changing amounts of data, which is great for when you're trying to fetch a list of recipes and you don't know how many recipes the user will find depending on the search results that they input. So, moving on from there, you will also notice that we make heavy use of the Material UI framework to ease up the creation of our UIs by having a bunch of ready-made components for us. Now, so as I said that all of our components are here except for two, and that is because if we look at the pages again, Gatsby will render all of these pages here at the URLs that have the exact same names as these files, apart from the index one, which will render at the base URL. So what happens if we want to have dynamic UIs? Say if we want to associate a cookbook, a particular user's cookbook, with their URL, so that you can share that user's cookbook by simply passing a link to someone who doesn't use this service. Well, that happens here in the book page, where we can see that we have a router. This is from a framework known as Reach Router, which is built into Gatsby. What this component will do is it looks at the page that you are currently on when you visit this page. It looks at the path that is the URL path of the page that you're visiting, and it renders different components depending. So if you just go to /book, it will show you a default rerouter, which will reroute you if you are not logged in, or else it will, well, it will basically do some stuff behind the scenes to make sure that you go to the right place, because the /book page itself doesn't really mean anything in our context. If you do have a book ID, it will show you a cookbook, and if you do have a cookbook ID and a corresponding recipe ID, it will show you a recipe component. Now, what's special about the recipe and cookbook components is that they are not static. They show different things depending on the IDs that you give to it. And so we have placed them here into the templates folder, where we have components that do not that basically change the content dynamically. So if we take a look here at the cookbook component, we can see that it is more or less a normal React component that heavily it makes heavy use of displaying dynamically gathered data, and this data is gathered dynamically via the use of a network call hook here, the use get cookbook by ID function. I will go over these in a moment. I should quickly mention before we move on that the models folder here contains a bunch of subfolders which are all various types of TypeScript interfaces for the different data types that we have to handle. So they should be documented by where in the code they are used mostly. We were not very consequent when me and my lab partner designed them, and so they are maybe not in the best folders right now, but you can basically figure out that the client models are all of the classes that are only ever used on the client and don't have anything to do with network calls or trying to access or send data to a backend, while the database queries and response models and search result models obviously are data that are returned from that same backend. So about the backend, we have gathered all of our network calls and other functions that we want to have globally accessible here in the services folder. And the most interesting part here, if we use the use get cookbook by ID as an example, is found in the queries folder, where we have gathered a bunch of globally accessible functions that we use essentially like hooks, hence the naming convention to always have them start with use. Let's see, so this is get use get cookbook by ID. Here we go. So first of all, I should tell you about our backend. For our backend, we use a service known as Fauna or FaunaDB. It is a web page that essentially acts like a cloud database, and you can communicate it in one of two ways. Either you can use their drivers, which are essentially libraries that allow you to speak to it depending on their own. They have their own documentation. You just programmatically talk to them. Or as of late, they have also exposed a GraphQL interface where you can send GraphQL's queries and mutations, and the web page and the database will respond in kind. So we decided to use GraphQL because it's very easy and nice to work with. So to do our GraphQL, all of GraphQL work is done by the Apollo Boost framework, which is also available directly in Gatsby. And what this allows us to do is to make inline GraphQL code that we can then fire off using the use query, the use query or the use mutation functions from the Apollo client that we have created. And this allows us to get various types of data. So in this case, we ask for cookbooks by ID, and we want to get the ID and some author identification, author information, a description of the cookbook's description, and the list of recipes found in that cookbook. So that is essentially how we do all of the communication with our backend. And now if we take a look here at the state folder, in the state folder we have gathered all of the logic that we need to keep states in our project, and this is essentially data that we want to have always available so that we can access it no matter where in the component tree we are, and we do not have to use the standard React way of passing props up and down in the tree, as that can get very difficult to follow very quickly. So what this essentially does, it is a heavily abstracted way of just using the React create context hook to create a variable that React will keep loaded even between its redraws. And it essentially boils down to the operator file, where we have created two objects, the use cookbooks hook and the use recipes book, which you can find further down in this file. By calling these hooks, you can get access to a number of references to various global variables that you can use to operate either on the current cookbook state or the current recipe state of the app, which means that we have a singular source of truth for all the cookbooks and all the cookbook search terms that the user currently has or has just written in. And this makes it a lot easier for us to handle cookbooks, because we only have to do it in a single place. And we can also define various states within these objects, and also create through the use of hooks various effects. So this is essential. So this, for instance, is a use effect hook, which will, whenever it sees that the cookbooks have finished loading, or that we have changed our mind on how we're going to use pagination, it will reload all the results and update our data accordingly. And these are some of the examples of the functions that we expose to make operations here. So we can use our pagination to fetch more cookbooks and append to our current list. We can clear our search terms and get more, and do a fresh search. We can update our search terms and things like that, which makes it very easy to work with. There is some commented code here that I will get to later when I talk about the problems we have encountered. But yes, that should essentially be it. So all of this together allows us to use Gatsby to simply create a website that works, and it minifies all of this together. And so for actually deploying the website, because as you may know, it is live right now, and you can go and have a look at it, and it runs. For that, we used a cloud service known as Netlify, which is a building and deployment platform. And in order to change some settings in Netlify, we here have a Netlify toml file in which we can set some settings that Netlify will look for when it builds. The way we have it set up is we use a Git hook. So whenever we push code to our Git repo, specifically to the develop branch, we will also notify Netlify that there is new code available. So Netlify will rebuild everything, and we will have the freshest version of the project up and running on a live URL. The most important bit in this particular file, however, is probably the redirects bit here, without which our dynamic routing would not work at all, because this here line tells Netlify to not automatically just give you a 404 if you give a book page that doesn't match. Without this, it would be impossible to have IDs in our book URLs. Yes, through Netlify we also get access to their identity framework, which is essentially a way to handle logins and users, creating users, and all of that again is packaged into our services here in the auth file, where we have used the API quite extensively to create various hooks that can be used to check user status and create new users and what have you. There seems to be some sort of problem with this particular, or something we have missed. We haven't really been able to track it down, but it seems like our web page loses connection with the Netlify login servers sometimes, which makes the entire web page stop working, which is one of the issues we have had, but we haven't been able to figure out a way to stop or figure out what is actually happening here. Other than that, our other choice of cloud platform, Fauna, has also had its own set of issues. As you saw, there were there was quite a lot of out-commented code, particularly in the operators here. So basically, if one looks through our code and sees out-commented code, then that is basically because we added a lot of code to implement a feature where you would be able to favorite another user's cookbook and also be able to view your list of cookbooks, so that you would more easily find the ones that you really liked. This ended up, we had to give up on this idea eventually, however, because interacting with Fauna to any greater extent means that you eventually have to write code in their proprietary language, Fauna query language, and this language is fairly ill-documented outside of a few specific use cases, which meant it was very, very difficult to figure out how to actually get it to return a list of cookbooks that matched a certain list of favorites. So we had to give up on this idea and therefore removed or commented out all the code pertaining to it so that it wouldn't be in the way. Other than that, that should be all of the code explained in this project. So I thank you for listening.